My name is Terence Jeyaretnam. I'm a Sri Lankan by birth, but I live and reside in Australia, in Melbourne, and I have worked predominantly in sustainability and climate change for the past 30 years. I was one of the first environmental engineers to graduate in Australia, and it was a passion area at the time, but it's now become one of the most important areas that the world has to deal with, and I couldn't have predicted that. So I'm glad that I did what I did, and I'm glad to be working in the field that I am. I'm currently a partner with the global firm Ernst & Young, who has a large climate change and sustainability practice globally, and we're a team of about 200 people in Australia. So Australia's response has been mixed, in my view. I think if you look at federal government response, depending on politics and bipartisanship at the time, we've had emission trading schemes, we've lost emission trading schemes, we've had strong climate policy, and we've not had such strong climate or renewable policies. So it has been mixed at the federal level. If you look at state, and Australia's separated into several states, most states have been quite progressive in terms of climate change response. So what we typically find at any particular time is that the state policies and state response and state commitment to climate change has been much higher than the federal level. If we then look at business response, business has been vastly, and I think in the global press, when you talk about Australian business, it's typically talked about as mining and coal jobs, but typically all the other industries, from construction to retail to education and all the small businesses, all of those industries have been quite progressive on climate change, to the point where some of Australia's companies lead the way in climate response, even at a global level. And finally, if we get to the community level, over time, community support has been getting stronger and stronger, to the point where I believe a survey that was done about 6 months ago, looking at postcode by postcode support for stronger climate action, every postcode in Australia wanted stronger climate action than not. So majority of the survey indicated that every postcode wanted stronger climate action. So it has been a mixed response, and typically what we find in global press is the federal government's response, and the federal government only recently committed to a 2050 net zero target, much later than other developed countries. Whereas what we find underneath that is that there's much stronger climate action. I believe parts of it can be. So when I talk about, I guess, developing countries, I tend to think, well, why would you want to go through the same sort of problems that developed countries have faced over time, and why would you not leapfrog into much better technologies and much better resources and much better policies? Why stumble your way through like developed countries like Australia has? So look at all the lessons learned. So from a policy point of view, I'd be saying, look at some of the lessons around institution of emissions trading scheme in Australia versus other countries, and look at what's worked, what's not worked, and work out what's going to best fit Sri Lanka. If we look at technology, over time, I think it's proved itself that renewable energy is going to be cheaper, better for the environment, create more jobs, and these lessons have over time been learnt, because at the time when renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy projects were being proposed, because of economies of scale and because of a lack of knowledge, there were a whole series of scenario outcomes. Whereas if we look at what the end result is 10, 20 years later, after we set a renewable energy target, is that you're finding that it's actually, the scenario that's played out is that it's actually much better outcome than what we anticipated. So, you know, in a country like Sri Lanka, you can, instead of going through that testing phase, you can move straight into setting a ambitious renewable energy target that you know, carries the country forward, allows certainty in the market so that investors come in and invest in those projects and can see long-term returns. If we then look at emission mitigation programs like what we've got a reporting scheme that large polluters have to report into, and pay penalties if they go above particular safeguard baselines. You know, if that is something that is workable in Sri Lanka, you'd look at the model, tweak it to the local market, and you take it forward. And finally, if you look at adaptation and resilience, I believe Sri Lanka's got, as a small island nation, quite a lot to deal with in terms of chronic and acute physical impacts of climate change. So the floods that used to happen every 100 years is happening much more frequently now. The coastal inundations greater, the saltwater intrusions greater. You got biodiversity loss. There's a whole range of things that are happening, heat stress, that again, you could have a look at how countries like Australia, who are islands, much bigger islands, have coped with in terms of managing some of that risk that communities face. You know, one of the examples is community infrastructure. How do you build a emergency response fabric and community infrastructure so that communities can better respond in an extreme weather situation, which is a learning out of the Australian fires and Australian floods, which I think can be replicated in other countries. So I believe it can be sort of a leaf out of the Australian learnings can be taken, but I would say don't go through every step. Look at leapfrogging so that you don't make the same mistakes along the way. In terms of tangible measures to improve connectivity, I'd probably say you'd have a look at the layers of connection points. So one, starting at the government level, it would be worth thinking about the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and some of the work that DFAT in Australia does with South Asian and Southeast Asian countries around climate change. There's a number of programs that are in place, and connecting into those programs would be one way of connecting and leveraging some of the work that we're doing here and some of the international aid and funding. I think academic institutions should be connecting better. I think there's a lot of work being done at the university level, whether it's in Sri Lanka or in Australia, and research that's shared and work that's done together, I think will enrich the learnings from both sides. Businesses are very global these days. So, you know, I work for companies like Ansell, which has a manufacturing site in Australia. The head office is here. We work for them globally on issues like climate change and sustainability. And I believe global businesses should be engaging better with their local head offices and local counterparts in Sri Lanka in terms of leveraging some of the measurement, reporting, as well as mitigation actions and targets that global businesses are setting for themselves. And finally, I think it's worth getting the civil society community together. I actually don't think there's much connection between organisations like Greenpeace Australia and Australian Conservation Foundation and the Climate Council here with similar organisations in Sri Lanka. And I think the connectivity between those organisations is worth enhancing. There are parts of Sri Lanka that are quite significant from a biodiversity point of view. And I don't know how much work's being put into making sure that they're being looked after through climate impacts. So I'd say those are probably the layers of connectivity that would enrich the discussion. The message I'd like to share is probably a little bit broader than the climate topic, although I think we can weave in the climate discussion. Sri Lanka's gone through quite a lot of civil unrest and turmoil and wars over the last 30 years, and I believe that continuing to bridge the sort of divide between the different communities of Sri Lanka, both locally and internationally, is going to help the country heal and to help the country prosper. And climate change as a mega trend globally is just one example of why we should be working together rather than working as different communities within the one Sri Lankan society.